right, so let's try our hand at putting together one of the black blocks. The block is going to look like this one, and we're going to start off with our foundation, okay? Grab some glue stick. You need just one of the add a 1/4 inch rulers like we covered in a previous video, and of course the stiff tag board type stuff. These are comic book boards, and for small blocks like this I just chop it in half. But let's grab the pieces of fabric that we need. As far as the strips, remember I had you cut out a bunch of different 1-inch wide strips from the fabric. You can set the bundle aside and just pick out one strip for now. So we are going to begin, and this is going to take a little bit of time, but I'm going to go as super step by step as I can to walk you through just the one block. The good thing about this Tulipán quilt is that you're making 20 identical blocks. 10 will look exactly like the black one, and the other 10 are the red blocks, but they're all the exact same blocks. So you're definitely going to get in a good amount of practice for foundation paper piecing. So we are going to look at our pattern on the foundation and start off with the first one, which is A1. And we're going to grab the fabric piece that we need for A1, which happens to be the background fabric. And I actually don't even have it up here, so let me grab that stack. All right, and here is my stack, and that's background chunks that are rectangles at 3 by 4, okay? So I'm going to start off with one of these because A1 is a background and so is A6, but we're here with A1. And so in foundation paper piecing, we stitch on the side of the paper because we're using the printed lines as our guide for sewing. So when you're sewing, you always have to be looking at this side because you want to stitch exactly on these dark, solid, bold black lines. So if you find yourself with a block flipped over and you're stitching somehow on just fabric, you know that you have it wrong. Flip it over so you can stitch on this side. Now the idea behind this technique is that I'm looking at the foundation here, but I'm building the block on it on the back side. So the wrong side of the fabric, sides of the chunks of fabric should be touching the wrong side of the paper. Does that make sense? Like both of them are facing pretty side out. So here's the pretty side of my block, and here's the pretty side of the foundation. So on one side facing out, I should see the lines, which is what I'm using as my guide to sew. And then on the other side, I should be looking at the front side of the block, right? The pretty side of it. So you're building it facing out on the back of your foundations. And this is probably the trickiest part for people, I think, is this kind of backwards idea that you're like adding fabric to the back side of a sheet of paper that you're not even looking at. But just try it. All right, so we're starting off with A1. So here's what I do. I flip the paper over. Here's A1. I'm going to put a little dab of the glue in the center of the A1 unit. And then I'm taking my fabric piece, and remember, wrong side of foundation, which is the side that doesn't have the printing marks, needs to be touching wrong side of the fabric. So ugly side of paper to ugly side of the fabric. And remember that the fabric needs to reach all the way around. It needs to extend past that delineated portion of just the A1 patchwork unit. So I'm going to put this over it so that it's covering the whole chunk that is A1. Okay, does that make sense? And if you need to add a little more glue, you can. This stuff is just going to peel right off in the end, but it just helps keep that initial piece down. Sometimes you might find it helpful to put the glue on the fabric first versus the paper, but that's all right. So now we've put a piece of fabric there. Well, we're going to sew A1 to the next one, which is A2, and A2 is a strip. So now we grab the fabric for A2. And remember I said we're going to be subcutting this down as we need it. So I just put it here next to A2, and I make sure that I extend past the seam allowance, and I extend past this way, and then I'm going to trim. So when you're trimming the little chunk that you're going to use, make sure that you're going past in both directions so you don't run the risk of coming up short with the piece of fabric you need. You always want more. So making sure it's longer than the shaded in portion for A2. I'm going to cut myself a little chunk, okay? Before I can put this where it needs to go so I can sew, here's what we do. We have one piece of fabric there. We're going to take our little tag board piece, and you're going to put it on the line that connects A1 to A2. So remember I mentioned in a previous video that every single one of these bold lines is a stitch line. So if in the end you go back and see and not every single line is stitched on, then you're missing a seam somewhere. So every single bold line has to be sewn. So that's what we're going to line this up on. The line or the seam line that is going to be sewn that will connect A1 to A2. Does that make sense? So I'm putting my little tag board edge on the line between 1 and 2. And I'm holding it there, and then I'm flipping my paper over snug against that card. And I'm kind of finger pressing it this way, okay, to create that crease. Now we'll take our add a 1/4 inch ruler. And if you notice, if you've never used this before, it has a lip on one side. That lip that sticks up is to catch, because remember we're using kind of a stiffer board, and so that's raised up because it's thicker than the paper. So that's going to get caught on that ridge, and that's what makes us be able to have a perfect 1/4 inch. From where you see that ridge, and you can see that I can't go past anymore, you see how this is sliding, and when I slide it in to meet where the paper is and the card, it catches. So then from there to this edge is exactly a 1/4 inch. So I'm trimming the fabric underneath to a 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to line that up with my strip, and you'll see. So with the add a 1/4 inch ruler there, I'm going to trim away everything that's beyond this, because that's allowing me just enough of a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew this fabric piece to this one. Okay? Now I can flip this back, remove my tag board, and now at that line, I have perfectly, from that line to here is exactly a 1/4 inch. So now, once you have that, here's what I like to tell my students. Flip it over so you're just looking at the fabric, right? And you're looking at the wrong side of the paper. And right now I want you to just pretend that the paper no longer exists. If this paper were not there, and I had these two pieces of fabric, this one and this one, we go back to the regular old patchwork and sewing mentality. We have two pieces of fabric and we want to sew them together. We line them up how? Pretty sides touching. This was cut as a strip, so you should have straight sides. And this has already been trimmed exactly to allow and include that 1/4 inch seam. So you're going to line up this straight edge with that straight edge. Pretty sides touching. And this is the part that people get confused because there's paper involved. But if you flip it over to the fabric side, once you're here, I want you to ignore the paper and just act like these are just two regular old pieces of fabric that you need to sew together like you would any other sewing project. You put them pretty sides touching. You line them up, right? And then you're going to sew. But remember, it's like the prep work is done here pretending that the paper doesn't exist, but the sewing must happen on the other side on the line. Remember? We're sewing on the bold lines. So because this is a small piece of fabric, I typically won't even bother to put any pins. I can just hold it. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we are going to sew the line that we drew that crease on, that we added the seam allowance to, and again, it's the one that connects A1 to A2. This bold line right here is where we're going to sew, and that on the back side, you'll see that it will sew together your two patchwork pieces. So let's grab this and head over to the sewing machine. All right, a little sewing machine prep before you start stitching. One is you want to use a regular thin piecing thread. Typically, quilters will use something like a 50 weight cotton, so that's actually what I have on here. Then I like to shorten my stitch length. The reason for that, at least for me, is that it's going to make the stitches shorter, so they make the stitches closer together, and that's going to perforate the paper more, so that when I get to the part where I'm ripping away the paper from the back of the block, it makes it a little bit easier to rip it all away. Now, if you're using something like a paper solvay, that might not be that important in that case because the paper will dissolve, but I'm using newsprint, so I will have to go back and rip off all the paper. So I like to shorten mine usually to about a 1.2 to 1.5. The bad thing about shortening your stitch length that short is that if you have to rip it out, it's going to be a nightmare. So typically, if I mess up, and I often do, and I have to start again, I will just literally pick up a different block. But if this is your first time, maybe try it out with a longer stitch length, and that way, if you do mess up, you can take them out a little bit easier before, you know, until you get the hang of it, because paper piecing can be a little tricky sometimes until you have that aha moment. All right, so we have our two fabric pieces. We pretend the paper's not there. Remember, they're pretty sides touching. I've lined them up edge to edge. And then it's like the paper magically reappears after the fabrics are together, because we need to sew from the actual line side. So the line that I'm sewing on is going to be the seam, remember the dark bold lines, between the two fabric pieces. So in our case, A1 and A2. The line in between them where I laid that card in earlier, that's the line I'm going to sew on. Now, to sew on this line, I don't backstitch. Instead, I start a few stitches in and up, meaning into the seam allowance, and I follow the line, and then I finish stitching a few stitches into the next one without backstitching, so I don't have that thread buildup, okay? So I'll show you how it works. I'm starting a little bit higher up than my line, and I'm just following the line, like stitching by lines and numbers. And I'm going to go a few stitches into the next one, and then cut my thread, and there's my stitch line, okay? After you sew on the line side, flip it over, and now it's like the paper disappears again. Now we're just dealing with fabric. So I usually, for small pieces like this, will just finger press. So there's A1 and A2, okay? If we flip it back, the next one is A3. So let me grab the fabric that we need for this unit here. All right, A3 is this fabric here. So let's go in the same order, all right? We have A2. If you look, there is a line between A2 and A3. So this has to be our next seam line that we sew here. So A2 is this that's already here. And so now we're going to add A3, but I need to have a fresh, crisp line here on where to add A3. So here's what we do. We flip it to the line side. We basically find the next seam that you're going to sew. Take your card and put it on that line. So now this is going on the line between A2 and A3, just like we did before. I'm going to fold this back, crease it there, okay? And let me get my cutting mat. So I have it creased on the line that I'm going to sew on. Take my add a quarter ruler, put it on that ridge there so it rides up and gives me exactly the 1/4 inch I need. And you're going to trim away whatever excess. I don't care what's there. Anything over to the right of that 1/4 inch is gone. Take this off, remove this. Now I have my fabric crisp edge that includes a 1/4 inch seam allowance that I need to add the next one to. So now when I have it on the fabric side, remember the paper no longer exists. So I'll line this up with here, and it's just like two pieces of fabric. We're going to put them pretty sides touching because that's what we need. So I'll put this here, raw edges matching, and then the paper magically reappears because I'm going to flip it over to the paper side, or the lines on the paper. So pretty sides touching on the back, hold it, flip it, and now you're going to sew on the line between A2 and A3 because that is the seam that we're using to connect these two pieces. Start a little bit into the seam allowance, follow the line, go a few stitches into the next line. So now I have a stitch line between A1, A2, between A2 and A3, and so far I think I'm doing it right? Flip it over, pull this back, and finger press. And it also helps to have an iron, but it depends on your setup if you're going to be getting up or sitting down to do this. Okay, so there's A1, A2, A3. Flip it over. Where's A4? A4 is here, and A4 is a strip. So I will grab this strip is next, okay? So now we look at the line between A3 and A4. Here it is, this bold line here. I'm going to take my card and slip my mat underneath it. Put the card on the line that you're going to sew next, so the one that's connecting A3 to A4. On the line, pull this back and crease it. Add a 1/4 ruler. Put it on the ridge there till it can't go anymore, and anything to the right of that is gone. Okay, now let's subcut this strip down so that it's just enough of what we need to fit the A4 slot. So remember, give yourself a little bit extra on top and a little bit extra on the bottom of the actual length of A4. So that's that. Flip it. When we're on the fabric side, remember, the paper doesn't exist. So look and see on what side A4 is. It goes here. So I'm lining this up right here. Pretty sides touching. And then the fabric is in position. My paper magically reappears so that I can sew on that line. And once you start getting to the bigger pieces, you may find that you need to put a little pin there. I usually don't even bother. So now I'm sewing the line that's touching between A3 and A4. Don't skip over and sew the next line, and that's probably going to happen because it happens to all of us. Just try and pay attention to each seam line as it progresses, and don't skip one. So I start a few stitches before. Just following the bold line. And a few stitches into the next one. All right, so the line between A3, A4 is sewn. Let's flip it, and let's flip this back and see what we got. Finger press it or iron it. Nice back. You don't want any puckers in there. And you can see that we're starting to get some really nice crisp points. Obviously, this is going to have another black strip going this way. But that looks good. Now let's go back and see where the next one is. A5. It's on this side. And A5 is a strip again. So we're going to grab our strip, keep it close by. Now, the line, okay, is going to be this one. That's connecting whatever this unit is here that we've been working on to A5. So it's actually A3 touching A5, but it's the next one. So we're going to do it in order. So the card goes on the line that's going to start the A5 section. Fold back. And because this is a good time to share this tip, because we take a few stitches into the seam allowance at the beginning and at the end of each seam line, you'll see that this happens. That when you go to pull it back, it's pulling the fabric up with you. It's super simple. Just push it back so it lays flat and you're able to put your add a quarter ruler right where you need it nice and flat. I trim away all the excess, remove my card, flip to the fabric side, give myself a long enough strip to reach. When I'm on the fabric side, the paper doesn't exist. So I just put the two fabrics, pretty sides touching. And then the paper reappears so that I can follow that line. The same line I just put the card on. I've stitched here, flip, and press back. Okay, so that's starting to look like it. Next one is A6, so we're attaching another one of these guys. So let's grab it, have it close by, but we need to trim. First you trim, okay? So I use my card on the line between A5 and A6, which is this line. Put my card there, fold the paper back, trim it away, remove the card. That's a straight line underneath here with an added 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now we can take this, line it up here, and flip to the paper side so I can have a line to follow for my seam allowance. So I grab it, try not to move it out of place, and then I stitch on the line between A5 and A6. There it is. All right, so here we have a mistake, and this is a perfect time to show you this so that you don't do it. Remember the pieces that we're using for these sections here, A1 and A6, they're rectangles. Well, I lined up the lengthwise part of the rectangle this way. So what happens is I wasted about 1.25 inches of fabric, and then I ended up being short here. So if you notice, this is not going to reach all the way. Because remember, the light line that's on the outline there is my seam allowance. So this needs to reach all the way up to there, and I'm like 1/4 of an inch short on the tip. So I'm going to take this out, and I'll show you. This is one of the reasons, even if you have the short stitch length, if you don't back stitch at the beginning and at the ends, it makes it a lot easier to remove this because there's no stitches that are anchoring this into place. So you'll see that even with the short 1.2 stitch length or so, I can just pull a little bit, get rid of a few stitches, and these seams for these smaller sections are quite short. So it doesn't take but a few seconds to remove this. And I'm doing it from the front side just so you can see. Be careful not to poke holes in your fabric if you're doing it from this side. Okay. So not bad. It doesn't matter if you like rip the paper a little bit or you poke holes, because remember, the paper is going to be gone in the end. You're only using the paper so you have a guideline. So even if I already have stitches there or holes in the paper, it's okay. I can still use it again. It's not a big deal. So instead of lining this up this way and wasting all this, we're going to line this up this way. Okay? So that instead I use the length of the rectangle to extend up to where I need it to be, because the portion of A6 is only this little bit. Okay? If that makes sense. And it's going to take a few tries like that, especially if you're cutting the pieces a little bit smaller and tighter, until you get the hang of it. So again, I've lined it up still there, pretty sides touching. We're going to flip it and sew on the line, and you'll see that that fixed the problem. Beautiful. So now I have plenty of coverage, and we'll flip it over just so you can see for sure. So this is A6, and you can see that my fabric extends past all the areas. So that is a quick fix. So keep that in mind when you're working on these sections, okay? So that's A6. Now let's move on to A7. And A7 is this bigger unit right here. All right, A7, here's the fabric for A7. Before we attach fabric or sew, remember, we're trimming. So let's see, A7. Now line, the closest line to the pieces that we've already sewn and that connects these ones to A7 is this line right here that's between A4 and A7, okay? You might see that different foundations will have you bounce around, but still go in order so that you know you're basically going from the ones that have already been sewn out to the rest. So this is A7. This is the closest line to the other pieces that have been sewn. We're going to stitch right here. So first we trim. On the line that we're going to stitch, we put our card, fold back, add 1/4 inch, and trim away anything else sticking out. Okay, so now, because this is an angled cut, we want to make sure that we don't have this shortage that we had in this other one here with this triangle, okay? So A7, it's going to go here. When it comes to angled pieces, and until you kind of get the hang of this, it's fun and it's kind of easy just to double check your work before you sew it. So here's what I do. Remember, we're on the fabric side now, and so we forget about the paper. So we're just trying to line these guys up pretty sides touching. So I'll say, if I try it this way, you just kind of hold it and flip it back and see if on the flip back, I cover the area of A7 that I need. And that looks like it's going to give me plenty of coverage. So I know that it's pretty safe to line it up here versus doing something like this, okay? If I did it like that, I can see it's too narrow here to fit the wide portion of the section that I need. Can you see how this is the wider portion? That means I need the wider portion of this chunk of fabric to be towards the bottom because it needs to cover that once it flips back. So we're going to go this way. Line it up raw edges. Hold on to it. Flip to the paper side and stitch on the line. In this case, happens to be between A4 and A7, but that's the one that's connecting A7 to the rest of these units. Okay, there it is. flip it back and flip it over. See how it's starting to come together? I love it. Super cool. All right, next one. We did 7. Let's do 8. A8 is a strip. So I will trim this down to size. Here's A8, this long one. Give myself some extra up top, some extra on the bottom. And that's the strip I'll need. So before we sew, we trim. So let's put this on A8. And this is the line that's connecting A7 to A8. Okay, it goes all the way across this way. This needs to go here, so we know we need to flip it onto itself so that we get pretty sides touching. All right, next one is 9. A9 is the largest chunk right here, this guy, okay? So before we add fabric, we trim. And we always trim from the paper side because you got to have a straight edge on a line. So we fold back. And now again, we want to make sure, because we're working with a triangle, that when we put this piece here, it's going to flip out correctly. So it would be pretty sides touching. If I did it like this, look what happens. There's no way that I'm going to get coverage down here, okay? Because you see how that shape goes this way. If we use on the longest angle of it like this, pretty sides touching, because that's how you got to sew it, and we flip back, that's how we can get the coverage. But notice I might be a little short here, so you got to scoot this down further. Because up here, it's really, really narrow. We don't need much. So here, and when I flip it back, that's when I'll get the most coverage. So when you do that, then hold it where you need it. Perfect. And you see, it covered everything I needed it to. A10 is this long strip here, okay? So again, we trim first by lining up the line that we can trim against. So sometimes that helps too, if you're a visual learner, to put it there the way it's supposed to look once it's sewn on, and then to ask yourself, okay, how can I sew this so that it looks like this once I press it back? And that, of course, is to flip it onto so that the pretty sides are touching. So we line that up. $11 is this other strip on the other side. Let me see if I have enough. Perfect. So first we trim from the paper side. And you can see the shape of it already. All we're missing are these last 2 background pieces. So if we flip them, you'll see one says A12, one says A13. At this point, it doesn't really matter which one you do first because they're the last ones left. So we'll just still follow in the order. So 12, we trim first. And then, remember that we cut out the background pieces and they were mirror image. So some need to go like these go that way and these go that way. You don't want to mix them up, okay? So put one in one of each. So this is going to be for 13, and this is actually for 12. Put these back and put them where they go so that way you know which one goes with which. Because it tapers off and narrows out at the tip, if you mix them up, it's not going to work, okay? So I'll set that one there. And then obviously this is a triangle that's remaining. Again, we play the little visual game and we ask ourselves, if we put it like this, will it cover? And the answer is, of course, yes. So this needs to be sewn right there. And to do that, I'm just going to flip it onto this edge. All right, and the last one is this one here. All right, so here is our block, and I love, love, love this part. It looks a hot mess, but we're gonna head over to the big cutting table, grab your rotary cutter and a square ruler, and we're gonna trim this guy up. All right, so this is my favorite part. I'm gonna grab my square ruler, we're gonna flip this guy over, and we're gonna trim on the outer lines, the outer seam allowance lines. Okay, and then you flip it over for the big reveal, and there is our first finished block. Not bad. If you're off by like a hair or two somewhere, like right here I have like 1/32 of an inch off, that's not a big deal. If it's going to get caught up in a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you're fine. Okay, so just be mindful of the way that you're orienting your pieces if you are cutting them exactly to the same sizes as I did. And when it gets to the angular cuts, these triangular pieces, just kind of audition it and flip it back and see if you have enough. If not, remember, like I mentioned in all the previous videos, make sure to start off with plenty more fabric than what you need. I tend to be quite frugal with mine, so it's almost like I enjoy pushing the boundaries to see whether or not I can make the fabric pieces fit. But I think that you should be fine with this, especially if you got some extra yardage to begin with. Once you get the hang of it and kind of the routine of the little pattern of paper piecing, I think it should be quite easy for you, especially since you're just creating 20 identical blocks to this one. So go ahead and either finish cutting up your fabrics and get started. You can work on your 10 black blocks, and then I'll meet you back here next week when I'm going to do basically the exact same thing, but I'm going to put together the red ones then. So that will give you another week to catch up, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.